Hello and welcome to Learn with Indrjeet. This is another video in the series of videos titled Building a To-Do Management System Application in the latest .NET 8 framework from Microsoft. In the previous video, we added a Razor Pages client application to the solution, and then we implemented the admin LTE template for the UI part. If you haven't watched that video, please go ahead and watch that too. In this video, we are going to implement a named HTTP client so that the web app, the client application, can communicate with the web API to fetch the records. So, let's get started. So here we are in Visual Studio. In order to implement the named HTTP client in the web app project so that it can fetch data from the web API, we'll add the API base URL in the app settings.json file, and we'll configure the named HTTP client in the program.cs. But before that, let's grab the API URL. For that, let's hit F5 to start the application in debug mode and go to the API. So here it is. Let's see how many to-do groups we have in the database. So as of now, we have 3 to-do groups, and these are coming from this request URL. So let's copy it up till API, and in the app settings.json file, API base URL should be that we copied from the Swagger. Okay, now let's configure it. Let's add it to the pipeline. So builder dot services dot add HTTP client. This method has 20 overloads. We want to use the one where we can specify the name and an action. Okay, so the name will be web API client, and then we'll have HTTP client, and we can specify the HTTP client base URL. HTTP client dot base address is equal to new URI, and we want to specify the name of this setting. So we want to read the base URL from configuration. So builder dot configuration, like so. Let's put in a comment, add HTTP client, add named HTTP client. Right now, next is we want to follow a design such that this page has no direct access to the HTTP client. So what we'll do is we'll create a HTTP client service which will use this HTTP client to fetch data from the API. Then this HTTP client service will be used by the module specific services. For example, to-do group service, to-do list service, to-do service that will implement in future. And all the module specific services will be there in a container called data service. So you will understand that once we implement. So let's have one folder for service interfaces. Let's stop the application and service interfaces, and then let's have another one for services where we'll put in the implementations, right? So first of all, let's add a new item called IHTTP client service. It will be a public interface, and let's put in some of the methods over here that we are going to implement. Let's remove this async from here. Every action here will be async, so from the current document we want to remove this async, right? So we have a get where we put in the path and a flag which specifies whether to add authentication header to the request or not. Let's comment out the post, put and delete for the time being, and also the get. We'll implement these later. Now let's implement this service in the services folder. So add a new item, HTTP client service. It will inherit from IHTTP client service, like so. And also let's inherit this from iDisposable so that the client could be disposed using web app pages service interfaces. Instead of making these folders in the pages, let's move them to the main folder. So let the pages be in a different folder. Fine. Now see, it has adjusted the namespace automatically. Now we'll say implement interface and we'll inject the HTTP client over here. So private read only HTTP client, and we need a constructor. So ctor and IHTTP client factory, like so, and we'll initialize the HTTP client using this factory. So HTTP client factory dot create client, and here we can specify the name, and the name of the client was web API client. And if the HTTP client is not null, then we'll dispose it in the dispose function, and in the get we want to fetch data from the API, right? For that, let's create another function, a private one, to get the response from a specific path. So what this function does is it uses the HTTP client get async method for the specified path and returns a HTTP response message, which we convert into our API response message and return that. So we'll use this get response here. So let's make it async and await get response and pass here the path like so. But first we need to decide whether add auth header is true or false. If this is true, we need to add the authentication header to the request, like this. So let's have a method for that, and let's not implement it yet. Okay, so it is saying if add author header flag is false, then simply get the response from the specified path in the API, and if it is true, then call a function to add authentication header to the request and then get the response. Otherwise, return unauthorized response, right? Now, this HTTP client service and this interface, when we'll implement all these verbs, then we are going to have more and more response overloads and these get overloads, right? So let's specify regions for that so that we can collapse them. So hashtag tab, this will be HTTP verbs, and let's put in the get inside of this. Okay, Control KD to format the document, and these are the response getters. So hashtag region tab response getters. Okay, and let's put this in this region. Okay, and let's move this dispose to the end like here, and the auth header to at the top. Okay, so now we have specific regions for specific functions, right? Control KD and save. So we have implemented the HTTP client service get method only. We'll implement these later. Now, this HTTP client service will be used by module specific services. So let's go to the service interface folder and add a new item there to groups service. So it will be an interface i2do groups service. Add that, and also let's copy this name and add a service for that. So this will be the implementation, and it will inherit i2do groups service, and this one is not from application interfaces, it is from web app service interfaces. Okay, save all. So in the i2do group service, we'll have these methods: get by id, create, edit and delete. So let's comment out these for the time being, and let's implement the interface. So this is the get method. What the to do service needs to do is to have the HTTP client service injected in the constructor. So private read only IHTTP client service, will name this whatever is suggested. Now the constructor and HTTP client service, let's initialize that and remove this. Okay, so it will be a public async task and will return await underscore HTTP client service dot get, like so. And why is it complaining? Because it wants to have a path and a flag for adding the auth header, true or false. So we'll provide the path as to do groups /get and false. For the time being, we are not adding the auth header. Okay, so now our to do groups service is implemented. Later on we'll uncomment these and we'll implement these two. Right now we don't want the pages to access the module specific services directly. We want to have a wrapper. For that, let's go to service interfaces, add a new item called iData service, and in the services, data service. To implement the iData service, and it is coming from web app service interfaces. So in the iData service, let's put in the iTodo group service. Later on we'll have iTodo lists, iTodos and other services in this container, and let's implement the interface. But before that, we want to have a private read only IHTTP client service from web app service interfaces as underscore, we'll put in the underscore later. Okay, and in the constructor ctor, we want to initialize this. So let's copy this, paste it over here, and let's copy this, paste, and is equal to this, right? And this will be having only a getter, so get, and let's move this one to just above the constructor to the top. Okay, and here let's initialize this to do groups. So to do groups is equal to new to do groups service, which will accept a HTTP client service object. So here it is. So let's do some spacing, and what we are doing here is we are initializing all the services. So later on we'll have to do groups, to do lists, to do to dos, and the pages will access the data service. This data service will access the module specific service, and then it will access the HTTP client service, which has access to the HTTP client, the named one, sorry, web API client. Okay, we named it web API client, right? Fine. So let's use this data service in the index page itself. Later on, we'll have a page for to-do groups, separate page, and we'll implement all the functionalities there. But just to check whatever we have implemented, let's use the data service over here. But before that, let's configure these in the program.cs. So here we want to add the HTTP client service, this one. So copy that and paste it here. So builder dot services dot add scoped. Whenever someone asks for this, give them this, right? And the same way we'll add the iData service. So add, let's go to the data service, this one, and builder dot services dot add scoped, like so. If someone asks for iData service, give them this, right? So now we want to ask for data service in this constructor. So private read only iData service that we want to take from web app service interfaces, and the name will be underscore data service. Okay, and we want to inject this. It is not yes. So add parameter to this constructor. So it is now injected through the constructor. Let's change it to async. Sorry, the task of action result. Put in async keyword also, because we are going to use await. So where API response is equal to underscore data service dot to do groups dot get, and that's it. We want to get all of the to dos that are there. So we want to await it, and then we'll have the application API response, and then we want to return the page like so. So a lot of coding. Let's test. So F5 to start the application in debug mode, and let's see. Let's put in, just a minute, let's put in a debug point over here, and it hits the endpoint. Let's go ahead and check if the API response is fetched. So yes, so there are 3 records that are fetched in the data, which is an array, and it has test group 1, test group 2, and the third one. Okay, now we have successfully make the Razor web app communicate with the web API to fetch to-do groups. So this is the same result that we were getting from the API here in the Swagger. Let me just continue that. Yeah. So to test group 1, test group 2 and test group 4. This was not visible there, but we have the result, right? So in this video, we started with implementing the HTTP client. We wanted a named HTTP client, and we added the base URL in app settings to JSON. Then we added a named HTTP client in the program CS, the builder services. Then we wanted to follow the architecture that the page should not directly access the HTTP client or the HTTP client service. So we wanted module specific services and a container for that. So the pages will access this container called data service. This container will have all the module specific services, and the module specific services will use HTTP client service to fetch the data, and finally the HTTP client service uses the named HTTP client to communicate with the API, right? So we implemented the HTTP client service, then to-do group service and the data service. So once you do it in the applications that you are building along, you will understand what we are doing and how beneficial it will be for future implementations, right? So please code along with me, build your application. If you have any doubts, queries, ask them in comments. If you like the content of these videos, please consider subscribing. Please hit the like button. Thank you for your time. Keep learning.